Welcome to the HealthTech episode of ASEI, Getting Ready with the Engineering webinar series. And I hope you all are staying safe and healthy amidst this global pandemic. And this is a very ominous moment for all of us to have some distinguished speakers here on the panel here. But before we introduce them, I just want to make sure we take a moment to talk about ASEI. And for those who are new to ASEI or are non-members or guests, let me say that American Society of Engineers of Indian origin is the best kept secret in the Silicon Valley, at least. We are a nascent chapter. This particular organization was started about 37 years ago out of Michigan, and we currently have about 5 active chapters, and Silicon Valley is one of the nascent chapters which has focused on STEM and programs related to youth, opportunities for internships and sponsoring science and science fair and Olympiads and so on and so forth. That having said, we are today going to be talking about a topic which is relevant to the survival of our species and increasing dissatisfaction of folks against the government action or inaction against being prepared for pandemics. Today, we are going to talk about healthcare innovation in general and its impact to society. So we truly have a global panel here consisting of healthcare innovators, Dilip Goswami from Florida and Dr. Sriram Iyer from UK. And both of these gentlemen are at the forefront of fighting this COVID crisis, and they will be sharing their story, moderated by Santosh Ankola, who is one of our directors on the ASEI SV board. So without much further ado, and since I didn't introduce myself, my name is Piyush Malik, and let me hand it over to Santosh.
Thanks, Piyush. Hello again, welcome everyone. My name is Santosh Ankola. As Piyush said, I'm a member of ASEI. Also work for Techcrunch, and I lead the product team there. So in our panel today, we have experts in health tech. We have Dilip Goswami, who is the co-founder and co-CEO of Molekule. Molekule is a science and technology company headquartered in San Francisco. Molekule designs and manufactures air purifiers. Dilip previously also served as a VP of technology and at Advanced Technologies and Testing Laboratories. Dilip holds a master's from Stanford in electrical engineering and a bachelor's from Florida. And he's currently out of Bay Area. And we also have Dr. Sriram Iyer. Dr. Sriram Iyer is a senior respiratory and sleep physician based in Liverpool, UK. He works in one of the largest sleep disorder centers in England. He's also currently providing expertise and at the forefront of NHS, which is the National Health Service for COVID response in Northwest England. He's also a subspecialist. He has a subspecialist interest in lung cancer and pleural disease and sleep disorders, and he has published quite a bit in those fields. Sriram is a fellow of Royal College of Physicians of London. And a fun fact about Sriram, he's a sleep expert for Welsh Rugby Union. So for those of you who are rugby fans, he's a good guy to connect to. So also one thing I wanted to let you guys know is feel free to write your questions in the Zoom. We'll pause in between, and Piyush is moderating the questions behind the scenes, but we'll pause and take any questions from the audience. So Dilip, let's start with you. Can you give a brief intro about you and about your journey into how you started Molekule? I know there is some personal story behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Molekule started because I grew up with asthma and allergies. So as a child, that was something that that was quite difficult from a health perspective. And over the years, we started looking into this my father started looking into this, not just as a parent, but also as a scientist. So a number of years ago, about 25 years ago, he was a distinguished university professor at University of Florida. And he started looking into this field because he had developed a technology for solar water purification that was being deployed by the Department of Defense. And he felt that it could be actually used to take care of the triggers in the air that make people like me sick or trigger our symptoms. And so that started a 25-year research journey. About 10 years ago, while I began working on my PhD at Stanford, I began working with him together on the technology side. And about 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago, we co-founded Molekule, which is reinventing air purification by actually using a photoelectrochemical process to destroy pollutants as opposed to just trying to capture them in filters. And you know, a lot of the audience may be familiar with our consumer products. We have a consumer air purifier. We also have a healthcare business where we work with hospitals as well. So that's a little bit about Molekule and my background.
Cool. Thank you. Sriram, you are a respiratory and a sleep physician, and also you're very closely working with tech. So can you tell us about your journey into, I know you have a company, private company called Sleep Vitality.
Thank you, Santosh. Thank you for the kind introduction. So, I mean, you really have, you know, you've made all the introductions. I don't have a great deal to add, really. I've been a medical doctor now for 18 years. I've been in the UK for close enough the same amount of time. I've been a pulmonologist for, that's US lingo, so respiratory physician here, pulmonologist in the US for about 10 years. And as you pointed out, I have areas of specialist interest in lung cancer intervention and sleep disorders. In terms of health tech, my practice has changed quite substantially over the last decade. I use state-of-the-art fiber optics for most of my intervention. I use auto-regulated ventilators and CPAP machines for my sleep patients. And we use pretty state-of-the-art home sleep testing equipment as well. I have set up a private enterprise called Sleep Vitality, which offers an ancillary service to private consumers who want to have rapid access to sleep diagnostics at home. I also provide treatment. We have an additional arm as part of the company that provides sports and performance expertise, which is an emerging field. And again, we use wearable tech there to try and improve quality of sleep and performance. I'm also working with a VR startup to build a VR platform for insomnia. So health tech is firmly embedded in my practice. More recently, I think COVID has turned everything upside down for us. We've dropped all our specialist areas of interest and we are purely focused on the front line. And as a pulmonologist, obviously, you know, COVID is literally, you know, I look after COVID wards and COVID patients. So that has made life more interesting. But equally, I think it has taken away expertise from what I really want to be doing in my other subspecialty disorders. So that's kind of a summary of where I am at the moment.
Thank you, Sriram. I think it's very useful. Dilip, I mean, you mentioned about like how Molekule helps is basically an air purifier, and COVID-19 is predominantly a respiratory illness. So, like, can you elaborate more on the potential role of air purifiers? And also, I think you briefly touched upon the Pico technology. For our viewers, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so first of all, say just from the role of air purifiers, the first and most important things that you can do are following the established guidelines, which are using PPE, hand washing. Those are the most important things that you can do to prevent COVID. However, you know, we've been working with the FDA and the CDC to look at the role of air purifiers in the space. And in order to explain that, let me tell you a little bit about the Pico technology. So a number of years ago, when my father started looking into this field, the primary, and what's still today primarily used for air purification, or is not really air purification at all, it's filtration. It's these filters called HEPA filters. And HEPA filters were invented way back in the 1940s as part of the Manhattan Project, believe it or not, to capture uranium dust. And they were never really intended to deal with the types of challenges we see with air pollution today. And so when my father was looking at, well, what could actually help me with my with getting rid of these allergens in the air that could actually trigger my symptoms, he took a different approach, which was, instead of trying to capture these pollutants in filters, which is especially problematic for the bioaerosols in the air, where mold could grow on that filter, or bacteria could potentially, even if they die, they could decay into, and endotoxins that were there in the cell walls could get released into the air. And so what he felt like a technology was needed that could actually destroy these pollutants, and that's what Pico does. So the Pico technology, or photoelectrochemical oxidation, what we do is we use light that's generated by LEDs inside of our device that shines on a specially coated filter surface. And when that filter surface sees light, it generates a chemical reaction, an oxidation reaction, that actually breaks apart the molecular bonds of the pollutants as they come through. And so this was something that we were discussing, because we've seen the difficulties of dealing with viruses when it comes to HEPA filters. And so back in January, actually, we were concerned about airborne infectious disease long before this happened, because of what we saw with SARS, with MERS. And so what we had been looking at for a long time was destruction of airborne pathogens. We got our first FDA 510K clearance for that back in 2017. And we recently received a new FDA 510K clearance for destruction of viruses, where we tested our devices with all of the commonly used viruses that are used for certification of personal protective equipment, and showed that we could very quickly in a room destroy, both remove these viruses from the air and then destroy them on the surface. And that's something that can potentially be of help, especially if you're already following the appropriate instructions of doing hand washing, wearing personal protective equipment, especially masks, and especially for the protection of healthcare workers, because masks are very important. But if you're performing, for example, an intubation procedure on a patient, that's an aerosol generating procedure. So you get a large volume of aerosols in the air. If you can remove them, that allows the mask to be that much more effective. So that's one example of why we're being deployed now in a healthcare setting to destroy these airborne viruses. And that's where I think the role of air purification can be as a help, as a supplement to existing personal protective equipment.
Fascinating. Thanks, Dilip. Sriram, I think it's a known fact that some countries have been more successful than other countries in dealing with the COVID. Very curious to know, like, what's latest on the ground as to how you guys are using technology, and do you think better use of technology is helping with the COVID-19?
Right. So there's been so much focus on that question, both internationally and at the workplace. We talk about nothing else all the time. So I could write a book on it. But the simple answer is I don't think we fully understand why some countries are dealing with this better. We have some theories. Also, I'll put it out there that it's difficult to directly compare countries, because demographics, the population cohort is different. There are different stages of the pandemic. So I think it's difficult to directly compare, but you're right. There's no doubt that some countries have embraced early testing, contact tracing, selected isolation much more effectively than others have. I guess a lot of that relates to health tech, so use of technology. So, for example, the South Koreans used a lot of used an app that used proximity to a COVID patient very effectively in trying to isolate people who have been contacts of COVID patients. So that worked very well for them. We've also been quite good at innovating and collaborating with both colleagues in the healthcare industry and even thinking outside of the box to get other colleagues involved. So, for example, I think we've had all sorts of tech companies come up to produce ventilators. So we had a collaboration here with Formula One teams and Mercedes, and they've come up with a model for a ventilator, for a CPAP machine that is currently being deployed. So Mercedes literally stopped all their F1 work and just focused on producing ventilators. So, I mean, that's a great example of collaboration. PPEs, as Dilip said, PPEs are hugely important here, and we are facing a global shortage of PPE for obvious reasons. I mean, nobody expected this degree of demand for PPEs. So I think in that context, trying to manufacture such large levels of PPE has been a huge challenge. So I think people are stepping up to the task. So I've got all sorts of small and cottage industries in the UK producing PPE equipment. Video comms, Zoom, we're using a lot more Zoom than we used to before. So that's again been a revelation, and it's perhaps informed us. It's been an iterative process of informing us of how things could work better in the future once the pandemic settles down. So, times of crisis has, allowed us to, or forced us to work together to innovate. So that's really been an eye-opening experience.
Thank you, Sriram. I think one of the silver linings with the COVID is also the funding aspect. Looks like, we definitely have seen a big uptick in funding in healthcare recently. Dilip, I know you guys received 38 million in Series C, not so, in the recent past. So what is your take on the future of funding in general, and how much of it can we expect going into healthcare?
Yeah, so I would say that you have to be, there's different prospects, right? So our company's been venture backed. We've also received government funding, and we've done some other aspects of funding as well. But I'd say that it's different based on the different it's a different climate based on the different areas. Venture funding is generally pretty cooled off. I would say that, even though people are publicly talking about business as usual, or, we're still open for business, privately, it's very difficult for a company, even in the healthcare space, to get venture funding, just because there's concern over the literal cash being available. A lot of LPs are pulling back, and so LPs are the limited partners from which the venture funds receive their funds, and so a lot of LPs are pulling back, and so it's a challenging climate in that regard, but it's not impossible. And certainly I would say that compared to, if you just take a little bit more than the very short-term view, the prospects for health tech and health innovation, I think the average VC is much more aware of the space now, because they see that lives are literally at stake based on these innovations. And I would say, I had a deck in 2013 where I talked about not just our air purifier, but a range of different interventions for airborne infectious disease based on what had happened with SARS and MERS, and people weren't really regarding it, whereas now, I'd say that the phone is ringing off the hook to see what can help in this regard. That's from a venture perspective. From a government funding perspective, at least in the U.S., there's quite a bit available. Each of the various divisions of the government have a good amount of discretionary funding that doesn't require direct congressional approval. Most of the congressional approval is primarily for stimulus, but there's quite a bit of other pools of money available to get things funded. the big challenge that we've seen so far is matching funding to the people who need it. So our conversations have been very different from, there are, for example, as we're trying to deploy in healthcare systems, hospitals where, there are large systems with quite a bit of money are finding it easy to find the money to deploy to deal with the current crisis and purchase the equipment and the PPE that they need. Smaller hospitals are finding it much more difficult. And so, we've, in places where we can't, where there's some difficulty there, we've tried as much as we can as a small startup, well, not so small anymore, but as a startup to donate equipment as well. So, I'd say that the funding landscape is context dependent, but I would say that the awareness of these issues is at an all-time high, and there's much more appetite for that funding, both in the government and then I'd say not in the short term, but maybe a little bit more in the long term on the venture side.
Thank you. So Sriram, on the same front, what do you think are some of the biggest differences when it comes to healthcare in UK and US or other parts of the world? And also, do you think if private investment is the future?
So, in answer to your first question, another big topic, another book to be written there. So, they're very different healthcare systems. As Dilip has pointed out, the focus is different. The way hospitals and physicians are paid is different. They are two ends of the spectrum. So, we are the largest publicly funded healthcare system in the world. I know we couldn't be more different. So I don't think that's going to change the response to an emergency, a medical situation like this. But in terms of funding, I have to agree. I think there is going to be a major economic recession following this, following the aftermath of this pandemic. So I think you've got to balance that with where, at least for the UK, where the government thinks the funding priorities are from a health perspective. So, for example, all activity, outpatient activity, inpatient activity, cancer activity has been cancelled in view of the pandemic. So we've got a lot of catching up to do. Whether or not R&D funding is going to be primarily the concern of the government immediately after the pandemic I think it remains to be seen. I suspect there is going to be a lot of push for us to clamber back clinical activity that we've lost. It might be very different in the US as the healthcare system is quite different. We'll have to balance current investment, capacity with what we think is the future demand. I think what the pandemic has highlighted is the importance of preparation and readiness. I don't think anybody was prepared for this. Although, as Dilip has pointed out, SARS and MERS have previously been warning shots across our bows. I don't think this was expected to the scale that it has developed into. And so there needs to be some thought given to preparation and readiness to be able to deal with something like this in the future. I don't think this particular chapter is going to be the end of coronavirus. I think we're going to see it in another iteration, maybe a few months down the line, maybe next year. It's going to keep coming back. So we need to be prepared for it in one way or another. And whether or not that preparation involves R&D funding upfront, I think remains to be seen.
You keep mentioning preparedness and readiness, Sriram. Do you think if this happened 10 years ago or 10 years from now, would we be in a better situation, or do you think it would be the same?
Well, I think most developed healthcare systems are smart and they learn from what has happened. If you look at how South Korea dealt with the current crisis, they built upon their experience from SARS and MERS, SARS mainly. So I think most of us will learn. And I think the focus of where the investment should be will change. And I think over the next 10 years, you will see more funding diverted towards prevention of pandemics, for example. I mean, I know there's a lot of controversy in the US about an emergency fund deployed for this purpose having been wiped out just before this happened. So I don't think that will happen again. I think if it does, it's going to be a major mistake.
Thank you. I want to pause for a second, pass it on to Piyush. Piyush, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, a bunch of questions have come up, and since we are talking about the pandemic, let's see if Sriram can talk about the potential for a successful vaccine being rolled out very shortly. And the second part of that question is if testing positive for antibody has anything, any indications in your area in UK, if you have found some innovative technique to solve this crisis, would love to hear that.
Thank you. Both very good questions. In terms of a vaccine, I think a vaccine will come. The development of a vaccine is a multi-step process. A lot of it is quite time consuming. I don't think it will come anytime soon, soon enough to make a difference in the next few weeks to months. I think the earliest a vaccine, as I'm told, the earliest a vaccine could be made available is end of the year. If you push through regulations and ignore everything that would normally hold back such development. So it's something that would probably help us in terms of tackling future pandemics like this. We expect COVID to evolve like influenza, for example. We expect it to mutate because that's what viruses do. The good news is that most mutations result in a more benign, harmless form of the virus, or benign, self-limiting form of the virus. At the end of the day, the virus isn't looking to kill the host. It needs the host for survival. So usually mutations lead to more benign forms of the virus. And, very much like influenza, where we have vaccines for influenza, which are being updated every year, depending on new strains that are being mutated all the time. So yes, a vaccine will come, but I don't think it'll come anytime soon. In regard to your second question, it's a great question. Understanding how many or what proportion of population are producing antibodies would be greatly helpful in assessing what proportion of a population have been exposed to the virus, and hence this concept of herd immunity. The problem we have at the moment is none of the antibody tests currently available, and there are several different formulations, are particularly reliable. So they have a very high false positive rate, and they have a very high false negative rate. So that means, a positive result is not necessarily very reassuring, and a negative result is not very, shouldn't be taken as being very pessimistic either. So antibody testing at the moment, we don't have an accurate test that's going to detect antibodies. But I think if there is one in the future, that will be the game changer.
So some tests I had been hearing about, some tests take about 45 minutes, some tests take many days and to give the result. And some tests, now recently I heard about an FDA approval for a 5-minute test. The efficacy of these tests, we don't have any data across many months or many years, like what we have in other diseases. So each of these tests, we don't know how effective they are, and only time will tell what tests, what vaccines, and what solutions come out of it. So that's the sense I'm getting from this. All right.
Correct. And the regulation changes from one country to another. People in Europe are generally quite skeptical about FDA regulations, and the FDA standards are not transferable across to Europe or to other parts of the world. So that's the first thing to lay out there. Antibody tests at the moment are not proven to be reliable enough to give you a consistent idea of what's happening on the ground. So it doesn't matter who's producing the antibody test. There is no data at the moment. And as you rightly pointed out, we don't know enough about this virus to be able to understand what the false negatives and false positives are. So antigen tests, which are what we are currently using to diagnose people, are reasonably accurate. They have a false negative rate of about 20%. So 1 in 5 people will have a negative test when they are actually positive for the virus, which is not too bad, because I think if you choose your population carefully and you test people who you think are going to be symptomatic or people who have clinical features, and you test them at the right time, don't test them too early, you are likely to identify people accurately. So antigen tests are helpful in understanding the current scenario if somebody has an infection. Antibody tests would be very helpful once they become reliable, but they are not reliable at the moment. And I know that the test you're speaking of that has recently had FDA approval, people are skeptical about it.
Got it. Thank you, Dr. Iyer. Now, Dilip, I have a question from the audience for you as well. And can the Pico Light unit be installed in businesses to clear the virus, like a light fixture? Is this a commercial product?
Yeah, so we do have a commercial product. It's I may have not explained this clearly, but the light is light inside of our device. So the way that our device works, in fact, I have one right here. I can show you. But the way it's my virtual background is not interacting well with it, but you can go to molekule.com to see the device. It's like a typical air purifier. So there's a physical shell that's drawing in air from the outside. It's running the air through our Pico filter, which is what is exposed to the light. So there's LEDs inside of the device, but it's not that light is not shining outside of the device. It's shining within the device to help make that process effective. We have had many businesses deploy our devices in order to, not just for this pandemic, but in general. There's a couple of different things that we do really, really well. One is, if you look at indoor air quality, typically in the US, it's about 5 times worse than the air outdoors. And so indoor air quality is typically quite poor. This has a general impact on productivity of workers, on absenteeism, due to sickness. And then, what we've also recently learned is that there's some correlation between exposure to pollution and an increased severity of COVID symptoms and disease. And so, of course, this is all early stuff. There's nothing that's been shown to be definite here, but it's certainly something to think about where this device could potentially help outside of actually removing the virus. And then in terms of removing the virus, where we've tested, we've been able to show about a 4 log reduction. That's 10 to the 4th reduction. So you can think about 1,000 times less, 10,000 times less virus. So if you had 10,000 viruses, you'd end up with 1, for example, in the air. That 4 log reduction, about 15 minutes of running in an operating room. So that can give you an idea of about, you can, you feel free to reach out to us if that's something of interest, but we can configure these for many different spaces. So I think it's quite important to deploy as much as we can. We've always thought about scaling our business up so that if something like this happens, that we can be useful. And now we're finding that opportunity to be helpful out there, and absolutely can be deployed commercially.
Great, thanks, Dilip. And another question came up, I think it's for you. Is there an automotive implementation of your technology that's commercially available?
We don't have a current commercially available automotive implementation. We have been working on automotive implementation. So if there's some interest there, feel free to reach out. Happy to exchange some contact info afterwards.
Absolutely. And I've seen and I've interacted with your co-CEO in the past, and the great story why Molekule was started. But I would want to, at the halfway mark, in fact, we are past the halfway mark, and I want to open up the aperture and talk about healthcare and innovations beyond the current crisis and current things. So if there are any trends that you want to highlight, each of you, if you can take a couple of minutes each and talk about what trends, top 3 trends in healthcare innovation you are very passionate about besides your current line of work, that'll open up the aperture for newer things to talk about. So any of you can get started. Maybe we'll start with Dilip.
Okay, yeah, sure. So one of the things that I've been most excited about on the, for example, device side, aside from what we're doing, is the potential for devices out there to track vital signals more deeply and be deployed for preventative care. So I'll give you an example of a startup. Some good friends of mine have started the company Siren Health. What they have is a smart fabric that can be very sensitive in detecting changes in temperature, and they've deployed this for early detection of diabetic foot. So before there's a sore that forms, they can detect that temperature gradient quite early, and they've actually got a better rate of success than the current clinical process. So things like that have been quite exciting. There have been things like that that haven't worked. Unfortunately, I would say that some, I think, irresponsible businesses, I think you can guess which ones, have cooled a lot of the excitement in the diagnostic space and some of these other areas. But I would say that people have still been, because these are important problems, people have still been hard at work, and with the current trends, it's coming back because people are seeing the need for preventative care, for diagnostics, for early detection of things, and so that's quite important. And then the other thing that I've seen is that virtually every startup in the healthcare space has deployed some sort of telehealth angle service, and that's because one of the chief things, at least in the U.S., that's been preventing innovations on both fronts has really been a lot of regulatory lockdown. There have been a lot of issues with data in telehealth, et cetera, and I think that some of those walls have come down recently with a recent relaxing of regulations around HIPAA. Now, there's good and bad to that. Those regulations are there for a purpose. So we should recognize that and make sure that we're protecting people. But at the same time, a lot of people were just loath to even touch the space because of what the regulatory landscape was, and so that sort of helped open things up.
Great, thanks, Dilip. Sriram, you want to take a few moments to talk about the same thing?
Sure. So my particular interest is in wearable tech, and wearable health tech has taken off in a big way around the world, and I think it's generally because I think people want to be healthier, and they want objective measurements of how healthy they are, and obviously in this current world where technology and data is everything, people want to be empowered with the data that they have access to. So I think wearable tech is going to be big. It is already big, and I think it will continue to be big. I know various companies that are working on different elements on how to non-invasively monitor cardiac and respiratory parameters, or in general monitor parameters of fitness in someone, and that encompasses everything from activity to sleep and quality of sleep, which is obviously an area of special interest of mine. So I think wearable tech is very exciting. And I have to be honest, I have not really looked at what Silicon Valley has been producing for wearable tech, and I'd be very interested if there are people who are working on wearable tech to hear their iterations of what is currently being worked on. But what I've seen so far, I think there is immense potential. The other area that is particularly interesting for me is virtual reality. So VR in health tech. So again, it has numerous applications, and even in a huge, a behemoth of a healthcare machinery like the NHS, we still have VR funding. In fact, there was 50 million funding approved 6 months ago for VR tech to be rolled out across the NHS in various areas. So, for example, mental health disorders, quite big now across the world, using VR to work with phobias, work with depression, work with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That's quite big. And the mental health community, I think, is particularly underfunded here. So there's plenty of private potential if there are venture capitalists interested in investing. The other area is things like sleep. I've spoken about sleep, insomnia. I mean, insomnia is huge. If you look at the footprint of insomnia, I think every one of us will have had insomnia at some point in our lives, and 1 in 3 of us around the world will have chronic insomnia that could potentially be helped by VR. So for me, VR and wearable tech are huge. There are obviously other things we could talk about. We could talk about healthcare apps, of which there are thousands. I have to admit, there are probably people in the audience who know more about healthcare apps than I do. But again, I see plenty of potential. In the UK, perhaps healthcare apps are being underutilized, not as well utilized as they should be. And that's again down to aspects that Dilip touched on, including regulation. And because we are such a big machinery and we are so answerable to the public, we probably have more bureaucracy than you guys do in America.
Excellent thoughts, guys. And I know there are a lot more questions coming in. So Santosh, I'll take one more question here from the audience and then hand it over to you.
Sure.
There was a question about need for contact tracing. Are there any drone system solutions to track the virus? If any of you know, and then there's a follow-up question on contact tracing that just came up in my mind. So why don't you answer that one, if any one of you know about drone-based solutions?
Like I said before, the Koreans used contact tracing apps to very good effect. So that is something that the other countries were hoping to emulate, but I don't think we got there on time. We've reached the stage of the pandemic now where contact tracing really, at this point in time doesn't make sense. It might make more sense once we have gotten over what we call the first wave, and we've got infections under control. And if you're looking for a second spike, then we could start aggressively contact tracing again. I'm sure maybe Dilip can answer the question on drones, because I not my area of expertise.
Yeah, I think it would be, if it's to track virus aerosols, it would be I don't think that there's a practical solution there, unfortunately. That's really a very lab-based thing, and it's not at all real time. So there's no way to sort of track these things in the air. If we're talking about tracking of people, I think apps just, you have if you can get over the privacy concerns, which I think are the major concern in the US, then using apps and geolocation is probably, and with beacons, etc., is probably the most effective way to do this. And you don't necessarily need to deploy something beyond that from a drone perspective.
Talking of that, actually, just last week I heard Apple and Google collaborating on tracing, contact tracing. So any thoughts on that? What do you think both these tech behemoths are tending to become a healthcare company, or for that matter, the investments in R&D in that space? I know Apple at least is putting in a lot of money, and philanthropic institutions are also pouring in. What do you make of Apple and Google collaboration in this space, Dilip?
Yeah, I would say it's certainly those two companies can definitely accomplish launching a really effective contact tracing app. The question is adoption. How do you do it? How do you make sure the privacy concerns are taken care of? I think that's something that Apple at least has a reputation for maintaining that. So hopefully that can help bolster the public confidence that their privacy will be maintained. But that's the real challenge there. In terms of acting as healthcare companies, I think both Apple and Google have, from a wearable perspective, been looking at this for a long time. Apple dabbled into the space with ResearchKit. There's certainly a focus with the Apple Watch. Google has Verily, of course, which is their healthcare sort of focused division that was focused on healthcare wearables. And so there's been interest for a long time. I think there's been a hesitance to deploy because of what the public reaction might be. and especially from the Google side. And I think it's been something that that's been discussed in these companies for very long periods of time. So they can certainly accomplish it from an app perspective, and both of these companies do have some focus in the area. And Google's now, of course, acquired Fitbit as well. So
yeah, the watch basically became a health device, and they've been collecting tons and tons of data. So it's real time. So it's very interesting space to be in. And I'm glad we have innovators like yourselves in the middle of it. And I'm sure there are more questions Santosh has. So over to you, Santosh.
Thanks, Piyush. A quick question on the telehealth. It looks like, in the recent days, nobody wants to go to hospital unless it's absolutely required. So, I mean, we are struggling right now to set up a Zoom call. What do you think is the future? I know Sriram also touched upon briefly VR and AR. Like, how soon can we see something which is potentially a thing which becomes a reality for all of us?
Well, telehealth is already in place. I mean, America had it several years ago. So I think there was a veterans group. I forget the context now, but basically there were these veterans who all had chronic health conditions, and I think to avoid putting them in care homes, they used telehealth to try and monitor them at home, and it worked quite successfully. So I think that is the angle you probably will have to take to deploy it. The fact that you're monitoring them at home in a safe environment and preventing them from coming into hospital or preventing them from going into a care home. Obviously, there are other applications. I mean, you could use them in different disease processes to try and pick up the deteriorating patient very early. The concern would be how safely this can be done outside of a hospital environment. That would be the main concern. And then there is concern of a false sense of reassurance that might be provided by a very narrow band of monitoring, whereas people with chronic diseases are quite heterogeneous, and there's a wide variety of things that can go wrong with them, not all of which will be picked up by a monitor or wearable technology at home. And the other thing that we have found is cognitive bias. So you're focused on one condition and you associate everything with that condition, and it's very easy to miss other presentations of other life-threatening conditions. So it's a difficult area, but I do think that, I mean, America, it's different in America, and I would be interested to see what Dilip's views are, because when you are working in a system where you get paid for your services that you offer, it's not such a big thing to try and avoid hospital admissions. Whereas for us, where public health, public money is at stake, it can be quite cost effective for us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say I would agree, especially with that last statement. I think that there have been telehealth options here in the U.S. for a very long period of time. Adoption in mainstream healthcare systems has been very slow because, again, they're getting paid directly for their symptoms. There wasn't as much of a concern about cost reduction. I would say that with in the past 10 years that some of that has changed. I mean, there is more now of a focus on value-based medical care as opposed to just billing. But and that's also because of the change in how insurance and the government is willing to pay for those things. So some of that has to be driven by external events. I would say that that consumers seeking direct care. There's a few healthcare startups that why am I forgetting the name of I think Aaron Bali, who was one of the founders of Udemy, has started a started a telehealth app a while back, and one of the things that, and basically full medical care. So they have their own clinics and their own telehealth apps. And one of the things that they said was that it was important for them to change incentives from the current very complicated medical system to something that was simpler and more aligned with the value for the patient, which I think, I think that's also the case in a public healthcare system, but it's a bit of a challenge here in the U.S. where it's private for profit. But I would say that across the board, because of the necessity, everybody's waking up to more adoption. These bigger healthcare systems are doing it as well, and they're finding that it can be, in the right cases, quite useful and quite beneficial for both them and their patients. So I don't think that a lot of them are going to go back to not using it after this.
That's good to know. Sriram.
And your second question with regard to VR and AI, again, that's the future. So both VR I've touched on before, but AI and machine learning, again, is going to be the future. We are seeing it being deployed in various sectors. Pathologists, they're replacing pathologists, and there's evidence to suggest that the machine learning is as good as having a consultant pathologist looking at slides. Cancer screening programs with algorithms, very clever machines. They have not quite replaced radiologists, but they're working in conjunction with radiologists. So that's another area, and I think you're going to see more oncotherapy, cancer therapy in the future being delivered by artificial learning machines.
Do you think, to add to that, do you think some of these AI ML will help create some form of human, clones that can help us go and do a faster clinical trials? I mean, that because the whole reason why it takes so long is because you need to find humans and then the real test. But do you see if there can be any sort of simulation?
Well, absolutely, and that's already happening now. And we know that they're using AI to fast track testing thousands of drugs, which might take years, now being reduced to just a matter of weeks. So undoubtedly, it's going to help.
Yeah, and I have to just interject here, since I come from the field of data and been working in the machine learning AI space for the last 8-9 years myself. First with IBM and now with this small startup SpringML. We've been seeing a lot of our clients in this space gravitate towards use of AI for early detection, and essentially the treasure trove of data that is being available, and then having some new techniques which enable powerful machines, in fact, even quantum computers, to be applied towards finding the cure. So it's very heartening to see how companies as well as countries here are collaborating in the face of this current crisis, and new business models I feel would emerge out of it. But more importantly, it's a collaboration in R&D that definitely needs to happen, and is already, what we are seeing is just the beginning of those things. So any further thoughts on those from anybody here on the panel? Or for that matter, anybody in the audience has anything to talk about, please put that in the chat box. And if we are not able to get to those questions, what we would do is we would do a follow-on, either a conversation or a one-on-one outreach, and we'll make sure we get you connected with the right folks. So back to you, Santosh, with that comment.
Thanks, Piyush. So Sriram is a sleep expert. I cannot go without asking a sleep expert question. One of my friends recently had a sleep test study done, and not to take the name, he had about 50 wires stuck to his head and chest and whatnot. So, like in this age, and what do you think is the future for that? And also, the reason I'm asking this question is like 25 years, 26 years of an average human sleeps. And then also the fascinating fact I recently found was of those, like 78 hours, 8 years of your life is just spent, tossing and turning in bed. So that's such an important fact. So Sriram, any thoughts?
Well, I hope it's not spent tossing and turning. It should be spent sleeping and recovering from travails of daily life. So, how is sleep changing? I mean, sleep medicine is now an accredited specialty, a specialty for the last 20, 25 years now. There are textbooks for sleep medicine. It is a specialty in its own right, and a very important specialty. And we have linked it now to all sorts of things like cardiovascular disease, strokes, worsened control of diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol. So it forms part of this metabolic circle that can impact on somebody's longevity. And again, it underlines the importance of sleep as a means of your body to recover. So, it's a huge area. The test that you speak of is a polysomnogram. I don't think we have any substitutes for it as yet. I've seen tech around for the last few months, wearable tech around, which is trying to distill all of that into just a few signals that can be non-invasively obtained from the patient at home. And I've even seen one that, a device that can just be placed next to the bedside, which tries to, indirectly get the same signal. So there is going to be further progress on this, and we are going to try and make it more and more user-friendly to obtain data. But it is a treasure trove of data. There is, hundreds of thousands of bytes of data in one sleep study that you can mine into. How will it make a difference? I think improving quality of sleep is going to improve most aspects of people's lives. Aspects of their health anyway. Whether it is treating conditions like sleep apnea, whether it is making sure that your sleep quality is enhanced on a night-by-night basis, whether it means treating hypoventilation, parasomnias, PTSD. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of sleep disorders. But in terms of sleep, technology is going to be key to making that journey to diagnosis and treatment easier.
Yeah, in fact, from my side, just to emphasize, I think the importance of sleep that Sriram mentioned. One of the things that we found in our initial clinical research when we were looking at prevention of allergy symptoms is the most critical point to deliver clean air is in what's called the sleep breathing zone. And in fact, if while the person is sleeping, you can deliver very clean air, you have a high probability of lowering their overall symptom score for the whole day. So we tracked ocular and nasal symptoms over the course of 4 weeks with about 50 patients, and we saw some really interesting things. It's not just us. There's a lot of existing literature about how important that sleep breathing zone is, and that's where you've seen the ability to make statistically significant differences in allergy symptoms. So there's probably, this is a treasure trove of I think improvements in general health that can be found in that space. So kudos to you, Sriram, for working and researching in that space.
Yeah. Thank you. I know we are almost out of time. Any closing remarks from both of you or comments?
I'll reiterate what was said before about not absorbing aspects of social media that are inaccurate about the current crisis. I think what Dilip has suggested is absolutely right. I think if you get the basics right of hand hygiene, social distancing, personal protective equipment, I think most of the battle is already won there. Also, I think important to point out that for people who are, I get a lot of scaremongering questions thrown at me, and I think it's important to point out that the majority of people with the virus will have a mild disease, will not have a severe disease. And I think there is a lot of stuff in the media about the number of deaths in a particular country or the number of people in hospital. And I think it is sometimes taken out of context. What is really important here is not how many people have died from COVID in a particular country. What is important is how many people would have died last year at the same time in the same month, and how is that different this year. Also important to work out, a lot of people who are dying, the majority of people who are dying are elderly with chronic conditions. And chances are that a lot of them would have succumbed to another illness at some point. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it is important to stay calm, but also important to understand where to go for accurate information and not be taken in by false information on social media. I think something I'm very passionate about.
Yeah, and the one thing that I'd add to that is that this is an evolving space. I think there are some lessons that that we're learning now that maybe in other places were learned even earlier, but it's good that we're learning them now, and keep to the correct authorities to get your information, but also understand that authorities will, and what they're saying, the message that they're saying will evolve for you, and so keep current on that information, because the latest knowledge that's being communicated by the correct authorities is what you need to follow. So keep up to date, keep vigilant. And the point that Sriram mentioned about, I don't think that this is a point for us to be panicked on, because panic doesn't help deal with a crisis, right? If you've been in any point of, forget about any point of leadership, but if you've been any point just in life in general, you've probably seen that when you're panicked, it's more difficult for you to deal with problems. And so be aware, be cautious and safe, but don't panic about the news, because if we're all able to follow the appropriate guidelines, then we will be able to deal with this crisis.
Thank you, Dilip, Sriram, very encouraging. So I just want to remind everyone that our next webinar is on education tech, very relevant to the current environment. Also, we have another amazing panel for you. So you can sign up for this webinar by going into aseiusa.org and clicking on the events. For all the ASEI members, don't forget to send feedback about today's webinar. Hopefully you enjoyed the show, and thank you all. Piyush, do you want to add anything?
No, great that Sriram, despite his time zone challenges, was able to join us. So thank you very much for not only joining, but also for your service to humanity in healthcare professionals as much as we can. We should be thanking, and of course, Dilip, for your innovations as well. Please join me in thanking Santosh as well for organizing this panel and conducting this first webinar. He came on board just last month with ASEI, and this is our first event for this year for the adults in this manner. We would have done a convention or a face-to-face event, but given the current scenarios, we are resorting to webinars. So we promise the members would be able to attend the events conducted by other chapters as well, but the ASEI events as of now, we are keeping it for free for anyone and everyone to participate. So thank you again for joining, and thanks to the panelists.
Have a great day.
And this recording will be available to others as well. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.